Hello, everyone. We're delighted to welcome you here today. I know people are joining us from all over the world, so we'll get started in a moment as more and more people are able to join our link today. But again, delighted you're here and looking forward to this conversation. Welcome for those of you who's just joined us. We see the number of participants climbing and excited that you're joining us from around the world for today's conversation. We'll get started in just a moment and looking forward to that. Welcome to the conversation that we're about to begin today on global voices to create welcoming communities. Glad that you're joining us, and we'll get started in just a moment. Welcome to those who are just joining. We're excited for the conversation today, and we'll get started in just a moment. Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Dryden-Peterson, and I'm an associate professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and director of the Refugee Reach Initiative. The Refugee Reach Initiative brings together researchers, educators, and policymakers to foster welcoming communities and quality education in settings of migration and displacement. I'm delighted to welcome you here today to this conversation as part of HGSE's Centennial Celebration Future of Education series and Harvard's Worldwide Week. Today, we'll be talking about a big question. What would it take to ensure that all young people have access to quality education and opportunities to be part of welcoming communities that support them to grow and to thrive? As with most big challenges, the ways forward on these big questions are not only in what decisions and actions we take, but how we make those decisions and how we take those actions with others. I am joined today by three people who do this work daily in schools and communities across 3 continents, and I look forward to introducing you to them. But first, a little housekeeping in this global home base that now is Zoom. Today's episode is being recorded, and it will be available for you to view on the Harvard Education YouTube channel and Facebook page. Or you can also visit hgse.me/future for recordings and information on our future episodes. Throughout today's webinar, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You'll also find closed caption access there. And now I'm delighted to welcome our guests. Suha Tutunji is academic director for the Jasur Refugee Education Program in Beirut, Lebanon, where she leads teachers of Syrian refugees. Stephen Lebete is a high school teacher at Alexander Sinton High School in Cape Town, South Africa. And Kamani James is a high school senior at Boston Latin Academy and student representative on the Boston School Committee in Boston in the United States. Please join me in welcoming them. Welcome to the 3 of you. So glad you can be here today. So here we are together, the 4 of us, and together we'd really like this event to take a forward-looking approach to how education can create welcoming communities in the context of isolationism, both politically and during this pandemic. We're going to focus the conversation on 3 central and interconnected challenges and opportunities related to listening, to belonging, and to collective responsibility. On listening, we're going to really look at this question of how do we come to understand each other? On belonging, the question of how do we create belonging in times when we feel threatened or vulnerable? And on collective responsibility, how do we reimagine our responsibilities to each other? So, on these three themes, listening, belonging, and collective responsibility, we'll start with listening. Kamani, Stephen, and Suha, each of you call home a country that has a long history of division and conflict. So, this question of how we come to understand each other really resonates in each of your everyday lives and work. Stephen, I wanted to begin with you. You've taught history in a high school in Cape Town, South Africa for many years under the apartheid government and in a democracy. As a teacher, how do you come to understand your students and how do you help your students to understand each other?
Yes, thanks so much, Sharon. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm really excited about this, and just very, very quickly for all those zooming in, South Africa has got a history of violence, deeply rooted in racism in the form of apartheid, and that is our reality. And 25 years of democracy hasn't entirely removed those consequences, And one of the areas in which the inequalities and huge differences between people and communities is in our schools, in education. And this pandemic and the subsequent lockdown in South Africa has taken a deadly zest in our schools. So for the more affluent students, they come from the more affluent homes and the affluent schools, they could have platforms like Zoom and Google Classroom. So it was business as usual for them. But for many of the poorer schools in the communities, like the one I teach in, these facilities were not available. So this is pretty much the context in which we're working with today in South Africa. And then just to focus on your question, I have in my teaching found that how I open up to how I get my learners to open up is to create a space within my history classroom. It needs to become a space I found over the years where they feel comfortable and free to open up about their life experience. And what I found, what I needed to have done was I needed to have re-looked at the power relationships in being a teacher and being a student. And I needed to have come down to that level. I run a very unorthodox, some people would say, unprofessional classroom, So I'll grab a chair and get in the middle of them, and we will have those conversations about their worlds, about what I don't make assumptions about their worlds or think I know. I let them tell me, they're not always where I want them to be. Our world is ablaze right now. I want my kids to be able to know and talk about Black Lives Matter. I want them to know about George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. I want them to know about what's happening in Gaza and Palestine. And I want them to be angry about those things. That's not necessarily always the case, Mm-hmm. So when I come down to that level and open those conversations with them, I don't make assumptions about what I think where they should be or what they should know, but I allow their conversations and feedbacks pretty much to guide me. And sometimes the results are phenomenal when I do that.
Thanks so much, Stephen. I see you smiling when you're talking about your students. I think in that way that only teachers do. You can kind of see them in your eyes and what you're describing. Kamani, you're at the same stage of your education as Stephen's students in Cape Town, but almost exactly halfway around the world in Boston. I wonder, as a high school student in Boston, in the United States, where schools are also quite often, most often, divided by race, by class, by national origin, where are you finding spaces to have these conversations like Stephen is talking about, especially with people whose experiences are different from your own? And I wonder if you have any examples of what those conversations look like.
Yeah, definitely. So, as you mentioned, I'm the student representative on the Boston School Committee here in Boston, Massachusetts. And I recently started my term on the committee. And going into this job, I thought that it was important to take a direction, one of empathy and truly listening, and being able to go back to the committee and explain to them what I hear students and teachers saying. And, when I have these conversations, I always think about, how can I be empathetic? How can I step out of myself, step away from my own perspective and my own mindset on certain issues, and be open-minded to what other people have to say. I recently spoke with some brilliant 8th grade students from the King K through 8 middle school here in Dorchester in Boston, Massachusetts. And we talked about everything from food to educational justice. And hearing them speak about food, I noticed that while some of the examples and the experiences that they had were different from mine, these were still real experiences. And I think that that is what is really crucial when you talk about policymaking and community building and educational reform. It boils down to, are you willing to listen to the people who are closest to the pain, and then have that be reflected in your work? So I very much enjoyed having conversations with teachers and students across my school district, and really just, again, stepping outside of myself and just being open-minded to what they have to say, and truly trying to put myself in their shoes and acknowledging that their experiences matter.
Thanks, Kamani. It's interesting to see some of these threads across, Stephen, what you're talking about in terms of not making assumptions and not thinking about where any student should be at. And these ideas of empathy, Kamani, that you're raising, and kind of listening to experiences that do seem similar to your own, but then also some that are very different. So I wonder if we could pick up on this. I know that you bring your own experiences of living and going to school during a civil war in Lebanon. And now you're working with Syrian young people and teachers who have fled conflict and live in precarious conditions, even while in Lebanon. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what you've learned from the Syrian teachers and students you work with that has resonated with your experiences of conflict, or that's surprised you and been quite different.
Thanks, Sarah. Hello, everyone. Good to be here. Yes, you're right. I did go to school during the Civil War. I was at the end of my elementary years when the Civil War started in Lebanon. And we had a lot of interrupted schooling, days on end without going to school, sometimes weeks, sometimes months. And at one time, I remember we did 2 academic years in one. And it was very frustrating because I felt that the teachers weren't really prepared to cope with this, and they weren't really teaching us skills. They were teaching us basics, just a little bit of English, maybe a bit of Arabic and math, sciences, just the sheer necessities to move on to the next stage without thinking of our future, without thinking of developing different ways of teaching us in such times of crisis. And so when the crisis started and we had the influx of the Syrian community, children and the whole Lebanon, I thought, well, I can really relate to what they're going through, and I decided to shift all the education attention towards the vulnerable children, because it's not their fault they were put in this situation. And the first thing that really struck me, the difference, is that the teachers, most of them are not teachers by profession. Mm-hmm. They were studying in Syria, or they were doing something else, but when they came to Lebanon, there was nothing they could do. They needed some kind of a job to get breadwinner for them, and they taught and they started teaching. But what really struck me is how their keenness, and they put their heart into teaching, even though they are not teachers. They wanted to learn, they wanted to move on, they asked for help. When we go in to observe and train them, they would tell us, please, give us some hints on how to move here, what to do there. We have this situation. And I thought this was really interesting. And when I talked to them about it, they said that, well, these are the future. The children are the future of Syria. And when we want to go back, they need to build a better future. And they need to do it through us. Who better to do it than us? We know their culture. We understand their history. And this is why we want do our best to teach them. And I could, see the difference between the teachers during the days when I was in elementary or in high school later on. Well, by the time the Civil War ended, I had finished university. So it was a long war. And the teachers that were teaching during the Civil War, this was really phenomenal. This passion to teach the children so that they won't have, they have a brighter future.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Suha. One of the, I think this in many ways transitions us nicely into this second theme of belonging, that each of you are talking about the ways in which in your schools and communities that you're taking actions to act on what you have come to understand, even if it wasn't what you originally thought, about your students, about your peers, about your teachers, and the kinds of inequalities that make people feel isolated and excluded, not just in their present conditions, but Suha, as you talk about, for imagining what their futures will look like. And I'd like to shift now to talk a little bit about some of the actions that you see creating belonging in times when we do feel threatened or vulnerable in these ways. Kamani, I know that you think a lot about the kinds of ways in which education either perpetuates or can help to mitigate some of the inequalities that young people are experiencing. And particularly right now during the COVID-19 pandemic, many of the inequalities in our education system have become highlighted, even though they are long-standing. You talk also about this idea of empathy, and I'm wondering if you can point to some examples of empathy and understanding across race and class lines during this time of extreme vulnerability that some, but not all, in Boston have experienced.
Yeah, definitely. So whenever I think about, well, just to sort of start off with how COVID has sort of shed light on the racial inequalities in both Boston and throughout the United States, I think about COVID sort of upending everything that was under the rug. Everything that society has swept under the rug is now out in the open. The rug is gone. We now have a mess that we are forced to face ourselves with. And here in Boston with my work on the school committee and sort of my interactions around racial inequality, I think about the fact that my friends and I created a Black student union at our school to talk about cases such as Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Rayshard Brooks and all the other Black individuals who were murdered here in the United States. And when we formed that Black student union, it wasn't just us Black students. We also invited our white peers as well in order to educate them on their white privilege, on white fragility, and what they can do in society in order to begin to chip away at the systematic issues and the systematic oppression that is perpetuating all of these murders and all of the achievement gaps and opportunity gaps that we see, and just the disparities between Black communities and white communities. So, there was one time where in the summertime, my BSU held a meeting with the BTU, the Boston Teachers Union of Boston. And we talked about not just race and class and how that is perpetuated in the Boston public school system, but also what do our relationships with teachers and students look like? How is racial equality and the need for a progressive society translated through content and pedagogy in the classroom? And I think that's really important because when we talk about how we can move towards that systematic change and reform needed to obtain a progressive, inclusive society, what we're really talking about is education. Where does it all start? It starts in the classrooms. It starts with teachers being able to translate empathy and racial equality and all of these abstract ideas into their work, and then not just teaching their students that, but then teaching them how to retain and present that to their own lives as well, and use that in the work that they do in their communities.
Thanks, Kamani. I wonder, Suha, if you might come in here as well, because I know these situations of extreme vulnerability, Kamani, like you're talking about, that kind of expose what has been under the rug for some, but not for all, over time, that these situations have become magnified in Lebanon recently too, and that when we do experience crises and resources are stretched thin, it's often harder to create these spaces for belonging, because everybody is legitimately worried about their own immediate safety and security as well. And Kamani, feel free to come back in on this after too, but maybe Suha, you can, I mean, you're living at least 4 simultaneous crises in Lebanon right now, with an economic collapse, a political crisis, COVID-19, and a country that per capita hosts the largest number of refugees in the world. I'm wondering what you see as the major challenges in this kind of vulnerable context of making refugee young people who you work with feel safe and like they do belong, despite all the threats against them.
Yes, exactly. And add to what you said that in Lebanon, there was a presence of the Syrian army for quite a while, which also added to this feeling of trying to make the Syrian community feel unwelcome because of the repercussions of the presence of the Syrian armies. It doesn't help on top of that. And the way that the people and the government look at it, they see the Syrian youth in Lebanon as being privileged, being in Lebanon, privileged to have an education, privileged to have medical aid or what have you. And as long as they look at it as a privilege and not as a right, it's very difficult to make these changes. So to start with, we have to work with the Lebanese community so that they can see that this is human right, basic human right to education, to shelter, to safety, to all the human rights needs for everyone, regardless. And this starts from there. And so I think that working with the youth on inclusion is very important amongst the Syrians and the Lebanese, so that they feel more belongingness. Working on policies for the government that makes things accessible more to the Syrian community. Maybe joint activities that they could do together. The media plays a very big role, because we all know how effective, how influential the media is. It can either pour in more hate, sorry to use the word, or it can bring the communities more together by the rhetoric that they use when they go write in a newspaper, or they go on TV, or all that. So it's really very, very challenging. And the best way is to listen to them, talk to them, and feel that you are listening, not just sitting there and nodding your head, but they're talking and you're really listening and you care and you try to do something about it. The more Lebanese do that with the Syrian community, the more comfortable they will feel in Lebanon, and they would begin to talk to each other, because right now they really rarely talk to each other. They're separated in the camps or whatever they're living, and it's sad. It doesn't help. It's a very, very difficult situation for the youth. And if we don't have open forums, talking and working together on activities, on whatever you have, the community, starting with the municipalities in a small scale, and then going bigger and bigger and bigger to a wider scale for the nation.
Yeah, and these spaces in which to actually have conversations don't always exist. And I think one of the things you mentioned before, Stephen, was just the way you see your history class as one of perhaps very few places where these conversations can actually happen. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about some of these themes that Kamani and Suha are raising up, where you're thinking about your history teaching as cultivating a sense of belonging, and yet in a context of inequalities that you're teaching about historically, but that your students are continuing to live on a daily basis. How do you help students grapple with this seeing of history repeating itself in the inequalities they experience, and yet at the same time trying to bring them closer together in understanding each other?
Absolutely. I think the question, the one on belonging, is very pertinent and very relevant to South Africa at the moment. Our society is still characterized in a huge way by issues of race divides and class. And that plays out in education, it plays out in the classroom. So the issue of belonging is one that's very relevant, and still today, 25 years into our democracy, it seems that sometimes, Siri, you were out here, it seems sometimes that we're more divided now than we were ever before. A friend of mine uses a very lovely term. He says we need to begin the process of decolonizing the mind, deracializing our kids' mind. The idea of a us and them, be it on race, be it on class, is very, very real in our schools, and particularly in the school in which I teach. And one of the things I do in my class, in bringing these issues and debates, say, for example, the issue of race, and the whole us and them idea, I speak about my own ideas with race. I, just as an example, I love giving them. I have a sister, an elder sister. She's in a mixed relationship. She has a white husband, and I tell my kids, I see them every day. It's not an issue with me. And I'm honest with them. I'll tell them if I go to the mall or if I'm in town and I see a mixed race couple, I stay, and they're like, so why do you do that? And I tell them, I don't really know why I do that. She said, so why do you look at them? I said, I don't know what I'm trying to find. And I get honest with my own issues of race or prejudices, if you want to call it, with that. And that provides a lovely space, a lovely platform for them to get open about their issues. Another thing I do with them, I tell them, look, at high school, you're at an age now where you're starting to get girlfriends and boyfriends. You're at that age now, and they normally love this exercise, and I tell them, now let's think about it. If you were to bring home a boyfriend or girlfriend from another race, how would that go down? And it normally generates animated conversation. Some go quiet and uncomfortable. Some are honest, some are like, I don't know if I do that. So in these little ways, I bring those awkward, those uncomfortable conversations. I bring it I open up about my own experiences with that. And that's normally a key that allows them to open up and to be honest about these things, and to get us to look at our own ideas. I would tell them, we're very, very different around white people sometimes. We act different. They said, sir, it is. I said, what do we do? We speak better, sir. Why do we do that? And we're getting to a lovely, so I try to get these learners to look at our own perceptions of race, our own perceptions of class, where it is that we come from. Why do we respond differently in these contexts? And I think when you open up, when you bring these debates into the classroom, and you demystify it, and you begin to discuss these things, you get wonderful responses from these young adults, and they're remarkably honest. Not always the answers I want to hear, but the answers nevertheless, and those are awesome experiences. Yeah.
Yeah, and if I may just add on to what Stephen was saying, I think that, I see a lot of connection between the first and second question. I see a lot of connection between listening and belonging. Yesterday, I had my third school committee meeting, and everyone knows that my favorite part of school committee is the public comment, where we get to hear from the community, because that's what truly informs our work. And it hit me yesterday that, with one teacher said, I'm proud to be a teacher, but this week, I'm not proud to be a teacher in Boston. And that really resonated with me, because there's a clear difference. There's a clear connection when you have teachers and students making public comment to, officials in power making decisions and drafting policy, and they're actually being listened to. when they feel listened to, when they're actually listened to, they feel as though they belong in the community. They feel as though that they have a direct impact in the responsive policy that is being put out into the community. However, when you have a body of people who aren't listening to the community and sort of just disregarding and saying, you know, like, I'll make the decision again if I want to, and that's just going to be it, then community members feel as though they don't belong. They feel defeated. And that creates turmoil, and that just deepens the divides that we already see in our systems and in our city. And I think that it's just really important to be able to not just listen to folks, but make sure that their words and their ideas and their pain is translated into the policy that's being created, because these policies aren't just band-aid solutions. These policies are slowly chipping away at the systematic divides that we see in our communities.
Thanks so much, Kimani, and wonderful to hear these conversations among the context too. Suha or Stephen or Kimani, there's a question that has come in, I see, that is really also getting at this idea of what happens when the space to create these conversations is actually risky for teachers or for students, when it is not allowed by law, by policy, to create a student union, for example, that would allow students to have a conversation, or could result in physical or other harm to young people and families. How do we approach making sure that we can create these kinds of spaces without exposing our young people to more harm?
Good question. Maybe one I would think in our context, you start with municipalities on a smaller scale rather than go big. Start with a small group in a city or a town where in our case we have Syrians and Lebanese, and move from there. So get them together in a municipality hall where it's safe and it's mixed with Lebanese and Syrians in our case, for example, and start on a small scale, working together until they feel safe being with each other in a community that they know, in an area that they know they're familiar with, rather than just pick them up and take them into an isolated place where they don't know one and they feel more threatened. I want to go back and talk about something that Kimani talked about, policies. And I think this is very important, because when the government also places policies that makes life miserable and more difficult for, in our case, the Syrian communities, it doesn't help with feeling of belongingness that we want to create between the youth. And so this is very important. For example, in Lebanon, we have 2 shifts. For the afternoon shift, the Syrians go to the afternoon shifts and the Lebanese to the morning shift. So they're creating even more of this division between the two. So start with going 1 shift schools in our case, why 2? And then break that barrier of this fright, this being afraid of each other, and feeling that they are all the same, the children, the students, and move from there.
And so one of these areas in which you're talking about these kind of actions to create space for belonging is around simply the structures also of schools as well. Like, can students be together in the same class across whatever lines of difference to have these conversations? I wonder if we might think a little bit about what is taught and how it's taught in classes as well, in thinking about what kind of curriculum can enable these conversations that each of you are talking about. And I don't know, Stephen or Kimani, if you might reflect on some of what you teach or what you learn that might give us some ideas to think about the kinds of curriculum that can foster these conversations.
Yeah, if I could come in there, we've been through, since democracy, about essentially 2 curriculum changes, in which we was fine-tuned and reworked, and it's not perfect, and I can only speak for my area of specialization, which is history, and we've been very fortunate in that regard in South Africa, is that it's broad. Prior to that, in the old South Africa under apartheid, the focus was on colonial apartheid history, and that's what our young people were taught, you know. And since entering democracy, and with our new curriculum currently in the subject area history, the topics and themes that have been identified and chosen, there's some lovely things like we do with the grade 11s, we do eugenics, the science of race, we do nationalism in the Middle East, and we look at the whole conflict, But I think what's important for me as an educator, and for my particular subject area, history only has value if we can use it today, So to bring in those conversations about the Middle East today, to bring in those conversations about the topic with my senior learners, with my grade 12s, civil rights in the United States. How is it playing out here today? So yes, for me, they are broader macro policy issues, but I need to ask myself, what do I do on the ground as a grassroots level educator? How do I take the material that I have that I'm required to teach, and how do I incorporate it with what is happening out there? I think that for me is the challenge, and one of the ways I try to do that, sorry, is I look at the topical themes, and together with my learners, create platforms and spaces where we interpret that in terms of what is happening in our world today. When our world is ablaze, it's a buzz right now. There's broad spectrum of things happening, and so it's to use this material to pursue those things.
Yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
I definitely agree. Me and my classes, I take AP United States history, and my A push teacher, every chance he gets at the beginning of class, he talks about current events. He talks about the racial inequalities and just the horrible acts of murder done to Black men and women in this country, and he incorporates that into his lesson. He talks about colonizers, the Italians, the Spanish conquistadors, the European colonizers coming to the Americas, to the Bahamas, and what implications did they make historically that have sort of created this social fabric, this social construct that has somehow carried its way all the way to today. And I think that when we talk about curriculum and how can we ensure that we're incorporating current events and these abstract ideas and these issues into curriculum being taught to students, I think it calls for more inclusive history that spans to indigenous peoples, Native Americans, the Taino people, natives everywhere, not just focusing on white history and not making our curriculum whitewashed, but more so being much more inclusive in diversity and thought. And then also giving readings that actually spark these conversations. I hear from my school and students in my school all the time that they don't want to read Shakespeare. They want to read books by Black authors that have to do with Black history and, civil rights movements. Over this summer, I read a book called The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. And he talked about religion and race and sort of how he was first introduced to it as a child. And as he grew up and as he went through his experiences being Black in America, how that transformed his thoughts around religion and race. And I think that that is extremely important, because what I found is that when we came back when school started back up again several weeks ago, people who read that book in our class, in my AP literature class, had much more interesting and engaged discussion about religion and race, because there was a direct connection, correlation as to what was going on today in society. So I think it's about getting the materials in the curriculum that are, like Stephen said, directly connected to the issues that we're facing in society, and not just making that connection, but then asking yourselves, how far have we come and how farther do we need to go?
I agree on the curriculum. I agree on what you're saying about the curriculum. It's a bit different here in our context to a certain extent, because our history is kind of more related because it was known as the Levant area, and we were all under the same kind of historical issues. But I think that curriculum, in our case, instead of condensing that they've done with the Syrians, don't change the curriculum, change the way you teach it. So maybe keep the subjects as they are, but don't teach it like you would teach any other class, just normal. Teach it so that you are teaching within the curriculum diversity and acceptance and all that. Not so this should be part and parcel, not isolated from what we teach. And for example, in Lebanon, we could teach about, at one time during World War I, the Lebanese were refugees, and they went to many other areas, and they had to live in conditions that were awful conditions. And then they made it because they were welcomed by others. So why not put ourselves in the shoes that put Syrians who are in Lebanon, the same situation? They are refugees, just like we and our great grandparents were refugees at one time, so that they could relate to what's going on and understand what's going on, and then maybe feel that we can together move on and do things together and belong with each other.
One of the questions that's come in from the audience, I think, connects to what each of the three of you are saying about your own context in terms of the importance of students making connections to what they're studying in school, to current events, to their own lives, to the kinds of issues, Stephen, you said this at the beginning, to the kinds of issues they want to get angry about and want to think hard enough about because they're angry about. And the question from the audience is really about how do, as teachers, students, teachers of teachers, how do we work to help young people who don't feel those connections to these issues see themselves and their own thinking matter in these kinds of discussions? And sometimes that can be a student in the United States studying South Africa or the Middle East and saying, this is so far away, it doesn't connect to me. Sometimes it might be a student in South Africa saying, this is ancient history, like this is different now and we should be focusing on it differently. And all of you have talked about the connections you see, but how do we make sure that all students can find these connections that are so critical to the listening and belonging you've talked about?
If I could come in, Sarah, I think that you've hit the nail on the head for me. You know, that is as teachers, you know, we often lament, particularly here in South Africa, where our learners are, you know, particularly when we teach them our country's history, you know, we teach them about apartheid, we teach them about these laws, we teach them about fight against that. They're just not there. They don't share the same enthusiasm that we did. They're not angry enough about those things. That, in fact, there seems to be a degree of apathy about those things, you know, and that is I'm not sure if I have an answer, you know, but I would say, I would agree with you that it is a huge passion. Maybe I need to look at myself as an educator. I need to look at myself as a teacher. And I think it comes back to what you were speaking, the first question, listening to these young people and seeing where they were. I've needed to learn this lesson the hard way over a number of years of teaching. You know, these kids are living in a different generation. Nelson Mandela doesn't mean the same thing to them as what he did to me when I was growing up. You know, they didn't live under the laws. They didn't live under the fight against it. You know, these young kids, they were born into democracy. So they're not going to share the same ideas and aspirations as what I did, you know. And I think I need to be conscious of this because there's a very real danger that I can impose this upon them. You know, I can want to instill this awareness and drive and anger about these things. And that I think is equally dangerous, you know. So I need to meet these young people at the place where they at today in the 21st century. You know, many of my learners, just as an example, you know, I want my kids to be angry about George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Gaza. The reality for me is I teach in a community where a lot of these young people, they come from gang-infested and drug-infested communities. They literally live in communities that where they're being held hostage by gang violence. You know, I'm asking, they living in a war, it's a war situation of their own, you know, and a little girl came to school one morning and she was late and she was shaking and we had to give us sugar water, you know. I said, what happened? So they were shooting on the bus terminus this morning, and that's the reality for many of these kids from the communities where I come from, you know. So before I impose and demand these things of them, I need to meet them at a place. They're living in a war zone of their own, you know. So what I try to do is I try to look at the reality of where they are in their lives and in their communities today and what it means for us and how I can incorporate that into my, and we need to have those conversations, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Stephen. I too see the apathy when it comes to certain situations. Both, you know, in small pockets of my community and just communities in general in the United States. And I think that sense of apathy is caused by a sense of defeat. I think that, you know, when you analyze the politics in this country, it's not really policy politics, it's grievance politics. It's people on national television just arguing with each other and taking shots at each other and their families, not talking about anything of substance. And when people see that on their television screens, they're thinking to themselves, well, there's no point in even, you know, getting involved in politics. They're not saying anything that is directly going to positively impact me and my family. And I think that's when you get that sense of apathy. When I try to talk to my friends, some of my friends about politics, it's sort of like, like, you know, they don't really want to talk about it because they've known that over the years, the politics in this country hasn't done them or their families really any good. And I think I would slightly agree with Stephen in that the answer is a difficult one. You know, I'm still searching for the answer. I think many people are still searching for the answer. But I think the first step, as Stephen said, is to have those conversations and try to get those individuals to understand how important it is. Yes, these people in office are most likely are not helping positively impact you and your family. They might very well be in it for themselves. However, it is still directly impacting you. Their selfishness in office still impacts you. And you need to hold your political figures and your political officials accountable for not directly serving you and your families, and just really getting through to them that politics in your city, in your state, in your country, in your town, as local and as national as it gets, it's still very important.
Thanks, Stephen and Kamani. I think this leads nicely into our third theme of collective responsibility, and just the very concrete examples that all three of you were talking about of the ways in which listening and belonging require not just isolated and individual kinds of actions and conversations, but really widespread action and conversations to create welcoming communities, and just how interconnected we all are, and yet often don't recognize in these kinds of conversations. So we have these interconnected kind of lives and how dependent we are one on the other in our communities. But at the same time, Kaimani, as you've just talked about too, this era of increasing kind of isolation, our limited ability to connect to each other as we try to protect each other from COVID-19, but also closed borders, increasing xenophobia, a kind of in it for myself attitude that we see in politics, not just in the United States, but in many countries around the world. And I'm wondering if we can think about how we reimagine our responsibilities to ourselves, to each other, in this kind of context. Suha, let's come back to you here. I know refugee education, I think, poses this particular dilemma of how to think about self and other and creating more inclusive identities. And I think we often see these questions from and faced by students, teachers, families of how to reconcile the needs of citizens and of refugees. So in a case like Lebanon, as you've talked about, where Lebanese nationals are often not having access to quality education, to the kinds of conversations of listening and belonging that we've talked about. And so what are the ways to open that space to non-nationals, to refugees? As a lifelong teacher yourself, what have you found to kind of move forward teaching and learning when these needs can often be incredibly in tension?
Yes, they do. And I said this and I'll say it again, that I think that the first step is to do away with the double shift that we have in our schools, because this is increasing the division. So much that when the Lebanese students, for example, leave in the morning, when they finish their schools at around 1:30, 2:30, and then the Syrian community come in, they leave them nasty notes in the desks. This is my desk, you're dirty, don't dirty my desk. Very hurtful things. And as long as they are divided like this and they can't come together and see each other as equals, this won't be solved. I think it's going to become even worse. So in my opinion, the first thing that should be done is do away with this two shifts, move into a one shift where there are activities that the children are doing together. And I don't mean activities like go and paint a wall or let's go plant trees. No, something that is long lasting, something that is sustainable, something that maybe a case study that they can work together on, where there are similarities between the two historical events, maybe one in Syria, one in Lebanon, and discouraging exclusion, encouraging inclusion. I think, and it should start, in my opinion, with the teachers first, and then move to because the teachers themselves are like that too. A lot of the teachers feel that, oh no, why should we waste our time and teach the second shift? We hardly wanted to teach the first shift. Start with the teachers, work on them, because then they are going to be able to work with the students if you're working with the teachers on how to have empathy, how to live in belongingness. I'll give you an example. I attended one class in one of the public schools. It was on civic education. And the teacher was asking them to draw, it was, I think, Flag Day or something. We have something like that in Lebanon, to draw the flag of their country. And there was one Syrian student in that classroom, because his mother is Lebanese. Imagine even discrimination up to that level. If your mother is Syrian, you can join the morning shift. If your mother isn't, if your mother is Lebanese. So it's even that segregation is even divided even more. And this young boy drew the Syrian flag, and the teacher really gave him a hard time. Why are you drawing, the Syrian flag? You should draw the Lebanese flag. Why should he draw the Lebanese flag? That's an example, just a simple example. So start with the teachers, work with them, because they themselves can project that into the classrooms. It all starts, in my opinion, in the classrooms, and from there it will move to the community.
Maybe Stephen, since you are a teacher every day in the classroom, how do you reflect on Suha's ideas here in Lebanon of, even when students are so segregated, as by policy in Lebanon or as by practice in South Africa, given the structure of the education system, how do you go about working against this kind of us versus them mentality? You called it a mindset earlier in the conversation, that can pervade students' lives.
Yes, it's I've got a huge respect for Suha and the work that they do out there. Just the conditions in working, that's crazy, And yes, how do we begin to break that divide? I think as Suha quite correctly said, it begins with us as teachers. I think we perpetuate that divide. We keep them apart. I was fortunate. Quick example. I was fortunate a few years ago, like 2 or 3 years ago, there was a Oxford student at our school who was doing research in terms of how students learn history. And she stayed for a very long period of time, when there were a lot of interactions between us. And she decided to take a group of my kids from my school to one of the more affluent schools on the other side of the line. When they came back and they were, whoa, they were animated. I think there's not enough of that. We perpetuate that, just in terms of integration in South Africa. The sad reality of it has been that in 25 years of democracy, integration happens on the more affluent level. So the more expensive, the more private schools, they tend to be more integrated. The kids of different races there. So they get a wonderful opportunity to do that. But for the more poorer schools, for the more ordinary working class schools, education in schools is still largely on racial lines, if you want to use that word. So so-called colored students will largely go to a colored school, black students will largely go to a black, and that the parents don't have money to afford that type of education. I'm going to answer this from an ordinary teacher on the ground. We don't, when that student was here, she even took I think the divide is so huge, that she took him to university one day, and even that is something beyond their reach, or at least it seems that way. Once again, I don't know if I have a genuine answer, and I'm going to go with Sue on this one, is that it's going to begin with us as teachers, man. I think it can happen in little ways, starting relationships with these schools, and say, hey, listen, do you mind if we come out there? Would you like to come out here? And just to begin to demystify them, or that other world, so that process needs to begin. There's not enough of that. In fact, there's hardly anything of that. And I think it perpetuates that divide, and it plays out in the bigger society. We're having more incidents of issues of race and racism and ugly spats, which I think in part stems to that.
Thanks, Stephen. Kamani, I wonder if I can put the last question to you. As we've talked about the kind of role that teachers play in this, as a student yourself and as a student leader, how do you think about kind of reimagining this collective that would bring more people together? And what's your role as a student leader in doing that?
Definitely. I think my role as a student leader is to simply advocate and amplify the voices of so many. When I got into this position on the Boston School Committee as a student representative, I had to seriously reevaluate how I was going to approach it. I had to ask myself, do I want to approach it in a very rigid and stubborn mindset, or do I want to be sort of open-minded to, what the committee would have to say, knowing the history of the committee? And, when I think about the collective in Boston, in my school district, and my responsibility to them, my responsibility, one, it's to the students, but it's also to the teachers as well, because there's a direct correlation between teachers and students. They are the ones in the classrooms. They're the ones closest to the pain. They're the ones that are having to suffer from a lack of resources and adequate funding. So to me, in my position, the collective is really teachers and students in Boston, and how I can advocate for them and amplify their voices. And, when we talk about, it does start from the classroom. It starts from the classroom. It starts from being able to implement those controversial and serious conversations into the curriculum. And teachers, like Suha said, teachers being able to teach that and practice that pedagogy in a way where they're conveying the material to students, but also lighting a passion and a fire under them to want to do something about those issues in society that they're learning about in their classrooms. And I think that's really important. And then the next step from there is I guess where I come in, being able to, sort of tell policymakers and decision makers, this is what we're talking about in our classrooms. This is what is directly correlating to the racial divides that we see in our community and throughout the country. And here's the policy that you need to put forth in order to address those issues and systematically begin to reform them.
Well, today we've focused on these themes of listening and belonging as a way to really think about how to redefine this kind of collective responsibility that each of you, Suha, Stephen, and Kamani, have talked about so centrally in terms of teachers and students and communities and how we come together. If you've enjoyed this conversation today, please visit hgse.me/future to find out about our upcoming episodes or to share or rewatch this conversation. We also hope you'll learn more about our work at the Refugee Reach Initiative, which you can reach at reach.gse.harvard.edu. So thank you again so much, all of you, for being part of this conversation. And from Stephen, Suha, Kamani, and we bid you good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from South Africa, Lebanon, and the United States. Thanks for being here.
Much.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh.